Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's CAS Roundtable conversation discussing our diversity, how our differences can bring us together. My name is Rosie O'Brien-Wojtek, and I'm an Assistant Executive Director at the Connecticut Association of Schools. One of my heroes, Michelle Obama, once said, and I quote, "I hate diversity workshops. Real change comes from having enough comfort to be really honest and say something really uncomfortable," unquote. Having enough comfort to be really honest and say something really uncomfortable. We're really excited about the workshop today because the panel of experts that we've assembled for our roundtable conversation are here to talk about just that. How do we create the safe and comfortable environments that will afford us the opportunities to have open, honest, two-way dialogue to understand our differences, discover our similarities, and bring us closer together? How do we as administrators and educators encourage, foster, and help facilitate conversations that help ourselves and others understand our own conscious and unconscious biases? Focus on multi-layered issues of diversity, including stereotyping and discrimination around age, race, gender, and disabilities. And actively engage school communities in deeply exploring social, emotional, racial, and equity issues that provide empathy and understanding to make a difference and bring about lasting change. How do we start and where do we begin? Well, the good news is that we've assembled a panel of experts on this very subject, and I'll introduce them to you in just a couple of minutes. But first, I want to thank our corporate partners, Jostens, Horace Mann, Liberty Bank, the Connecticut Army National Guard, and Pullman and Comley for helping to make this webinar possible. We thank them for their continuing support of our CAS professional development webinars for all principals and educators in Connecticut. Again, we're very excited to bring you this webinar and glad that you're joining us today. As a reminder, the session will be recorded and posted on the CAS website so you can view it later and share it with your colleagues, as well as your faculty and staff. Please use the chat feature as a way to stay actively engaged in the learning during this session and to let us know if you have any technical issues, as we will be monitoring the chat. In addition, please use the Q&A features to ask questions, as we will also be monitoring the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer your questions during this session. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts for this webinar. They are, first of all, Reverend Dr. Audley Donaldson, who's an ordained Episcopal priest. He's served in a variety of pastoral, administrative, and academic settings. He's worked extensively with a number of universities across America, unions, as well as public and private school systems. He holds a master's degree from Yale Divinity School, 4 units of clinical pastoral education from Yale School of Medicine, and a doctorate from the New York Theological Seminary. Welcome, Audley.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next we have Paul Vivian, who has a wide range of experiences in the fields of education and family support. Paul began his career in 1974 working with Boston Public Schools, helping families deal with the busing crisis brought about by court-ordered desegregation. He then served as the Director of Youth Services for the City of Bristol, Connecticut. In 1989, Paul came to work for the state of Connecticut as the first program manager for Connecticut's Family Resource Center program. He also served as mediator, facilitating solutions with school administrators and teachers across Connecticut. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Robert Garry is currently the principal of Hatton Elementary School in Southington. Bob has been an educator for 28 years with teaching and school leadership experiences in both urban and suburban districts. He's been working with CAS as a presenter and organizer of the elementary and middle school student leadership conferences since 1998. He's worked with Paul Vivian and Audley Donaldson as a principal and a teacher in several school districts, and will share how they've worked together to create positive and safe spaces where students and staff can actively engage in conversations that build understanding and empathy on topics related to diversity, social and racial justice, and equity. Welcome, Bob.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
And Cherese Miller-Odukwe is the Director of Student Activities at CAS. Cherese earned her bachelor's degree in education from CCSU and her master's degree in education at Springfield College in Massachusetts. During her 14 years at Prince Technical High School, Cherese served in a variety of roles, including as an English teacher, director of athletics, and a coach. Currently, through her work at CAS, Cherese is responsible for a number of student activity programs across the state, including both the CAS Student Leadership and CAS Student Equity Advisory Councils. Cherese champions student leadership, encouraging and supporting students in finding and sharing their voices on issues such as leadership, equity, and racial social justice, Welcome, Cherese.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great, thank you. So what I didn't tell and say in the intro is that I've had the pleasure with working with all four of these panel members today. So I know this is going to be a lot of fun and a very informative conversation. So let's get started. I first met Paul and Audley when they came to Ivy Drive Elementary School in Bristol, where I served as a principal for 20 years. And I won't say how long ago that was, but Paul and Audley have been providing interactive workshops on diversity for over 22 years. So let's get started by having both you, Paul and Audley, talk about the work that you do. Tell us why the work is so important and how you got started.
Well, first of all, thank you all for having us. And it's great, an honor to be on this call. Audley and I have, first of all, and I think this is really important to mention, have been friends for over 30 years. And so when we work together and when whether we're in front of students or in front of educators or a corporate group, people see the kind of seamless energy that we bring that's part of our relationship that we've had with each other for 30 years. We try to show that although we do look different on the outside, I don't know if people can tell, if you can say this, but barely. Audley does not have hair, and I have white hair. That besides that, we have so much of us that is similar to one another, and we share that. We began our journey, actually, as you mentioned, Rosie, I was the director of youth services in Bristol for a number of years. And during that time, I became good friends with Ann Clark, who was the assistant superintendent of schools. When I left Bristol to go do other things, she had called me because it was an incident with Project Choice students coming to Bristol and parents being very upset about that. There were many parents in Bristol who were thinking these children, I mean, we're talking about kindergartners, but they thought they were going to be bringing guns and gangs to school and so on. And so I connected with Audley and said, she said, is there a way that we could have a conversation about this? So Audley and I had a series of conversations with parents to kind of just talk about the importance of diversity and the differences and what those students, not what they bring in a negative way, what they bring in a positive way, so that their students' lives in Bristol were broadened by having these kids from Hartford. From that, we began working with elementary school students, and Audley and I have developed a curriculum for grade 3 students, grade 5 students, and middle school students, as well as we do things in the high school as well. And in each of those, as we say, we raise the bar to talk about diversity in a way as two friends discussing differences. And I think that's really key. So Audley, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. The beauty too, Rosie, of what we have done over the years is that we're now seeing teachers who were students who went through our program I mean, that may date us a little bit, and some of them do remember notions of stereotype, and that is exactly the plan, Paul, that they would come through our training and then impart to others. We're also seeing some of the students who we taught are now parents of children who are in the school system. And the presumption is therefore that it becomes generational, that the conversation that we started 30 years ago, that parents are having that conversation with their children around the dining table, because they know, having gone through this and understand the concept of diversity, are in fact informing and transforming, or whatever word you choose to use, the minds of their children. And that was the original intent, Paul, I think.
I think to add to that, so what we do at each grade is very, very different, obviously. And so people often say to us, well, what do you do with third graders? Well, we talk about differences in families. And so we have kids in third graders. We first of all compare the differences of people living in a community to a salad. And we talk about all the wonderful things that make up a great salad. And we have kids list them for us. And we put them on the board. And there's, bacon bits and lettuce and tomatoes and cheese and so on and so on and so on. And then Audley will say, well, what if we got rid of the cheese? And what if we got rid of the bacon bits? And so that we have left maybe iceberg lettuce and a tomato. It's still a salad, but not as good. And so the diversity, we want to introduce the concept that diversity is a good thing. Then we talk about how in this community, who lives in this community? And with third graders, invariably they say, policemen is the first one, and firefighters. And then they list nurses and doctors. And then they'll say, Italian people live here, and Black people live here, and Polish people live here. So we list all these different groups. And we talk, look at the richness in this community with all these different people. But what if and we start erasing, what if there were no more teachers here? And then sometimes the kids cheer, sometimes they don't, but then they say, hey, if there's no teachers, we don't really need students. So we erase those. And then, so we make it fun. And then we talk about the differences in our families. So that I'll say, what if I was raised by my grandmother? Is that okay? And sometimes the kid will say, no, that's not as good.
Right.
We'll say, why? And he'll say, well, because you should have a mother and a father. We'll say, well, yeah, but my grandmother loves me. What if my parents are divorced and I live just with my mom? Is that okay? So we try to get kids to define, or what if I have two moms or two dads? We try to get them to define that a family is a group of people that love you. And then we have the kids draw a picture of their family, and then they share with their classmates. And we think that's a really rich experience for the kids.
And remember too that Connecticut have been having this conversation. Well, America has been having this conversation for a very long time.
Ooh.
Deliberately tried to do is to make sure that what we do with students don't leave them feeling ashamed, so that, because I think the traditional kind of a mantra of diversity training has been to beat people over their head with you should feel guilty for what you have done or what you haven't done, and you obviously can't do that, nor should you do that, and we don't think that's a healthy way to impart concepts around diversity. So it really is, it provokes them, it gives them another lens through which they can see the world, but it raises for them a kind of a aha moment. So, so what if a kid has two moms? And interestingly enough, there may be a kid in the back who says, I have two moms, and all of a sudden the classroom becomes dead quiet because they never thought about that. That is a living, breathing student who has two moms and who feels no sense of anything and is very happy. So how do you embrace that? That, I think, has been the challenge, and I think the beauty of what we do.
And just add one more thing too, because I don't want to just dominate on this conversation, but we also branch off into talking about the differences between us. We play this game called Which One of Us? And we ask the kids, which one of us do you think likes basketball more? And invariably, fifth graders will say, oh, that's easy. It's Audley, because he's a black guy. They won't often say it's because he's a black guy. They'll say, because he looks taller. I know you can't tell
like
from the
Jordan.
you can't tell from the Zoom call, but he's not taller. But the funny thing about that is we try to get kids to identify, the differences between us, and that when we morph this into talking about stereotypes. And when you stereotype a person, you're often wrong, and that sometimes it can be hurtful. And then we talk about immigration. So we have a whole series of things, which I think we'll talk about throughout the course of this conversation.
I love your metaphor about the salad, but I wonder, just to kind of frame this, what you guys talk about multi-layered issues of diversity. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the first thing you could think is, well, there's a black guy and there's a white guy. So diversity means a discussion about pigmentation or skin color. And we have been very deliberate in saying that the conversation that America needs to have is not just about race. Obviously, yes, race is foundational. But we have, over the years, Paul, attempted to embrace everything from human sexuality to body size. I mean, consider for a minute kids who are bullied because they're overweight. And you don't normally think of that as a diversity issue, but it is, because if I have to change 4 or 5 different outfits every morning to try and find one that makes me skinny or look skinny before I get to school, because some kid is gonna say, you're fat or you're ugly, or that you eat too much, or that you spend too much time on the couch or in Happy Meal line. I mean, think about how that affects me. Secondly, we've also included issues around disabilities. We do an activity, and Paul probably can describe that to you, around kids who have dyslexia. And who would ever think that dyslexia becomes an issue in diversity, when it is, by the way? Because if I'm at the volunteer in my class trying to read, and you're there laughing at me because I'm slow or I'm not as efficient as you think I should be, when in actual fact, I'm really giving it my best shot. I think I'm doing good, by the way. I'm so proud of myself, but you're there screaming at me because I'm slow. Think about it. This dyslexia, you can't see that I have dyslexia. And it's so common. Paul, yeah, I know you're trying to say.
I was just going to say that to me, that's one of the more powerful things that we do. Audley asks the class, this is with 5th graders, I need 5 excellent readers. And so all these, very bright kids shoot their hands up, and he picks 5 kids. And then we have a paper, it's a poem called Changes, that is written as how a dyslexic person would see it. And Audley gives a stanza to each kid to read, and they can't read it. And the kids in the audience, we give the same poem, but we give it, it's a non-dyslexic version. It's a regular form that says the paper. And they can't understand why their classmates can't read it. Not only that, oftentimes they laugh, or they giggle, or they make fun of, or they yell the words out to the students. And the point where we want those students to feel for 2 minutes what it's like as a very bright person to be frustrated that you can't read what's in front of you, and how your classmates might be perceiving you. And then for the class, we share with them, imagine what that's like.
Right.
To be up in front and stumbling and having a difficult time and having your friends yell the word out because you're too slow. So to me, it's a very powerful lesson. And we've had kids talk about this. A number of teachers have sent us letters after we're done. And that's one of the overriding segments of our presentation that sticks with kids, that was a very powerful thing. And I think it just shows that, 10% of the population is dyslexic. It's a disability you cannot see. And maybe you should think about that the next time you see someone stumbling when they're having difficulty reading.
Let me just add one more thing, and I'll keep quiet. Even in terms of ethnicity, America has not necessarily been including that as a part of this discussion, but it is. I'm an immigrant. I came here from Jamaica. My wife and I are raising our daughter in a bicultural home. We've asked her, yes, assimilate, yes, be American, but it doesn't mean that you're un-American or unpatriotic, for example. If you speak 2 or 3 different languages, I can't tell you how many kids in Connecticut, when you ask them, are you bilingual? They are ashamed to raise their hand. Is Italian spoken in your home, or is Polish? Because they believe it makes them un-American, which is so silly, by the way, because the European kids are speaking 3, 4, 5 different languages, and they're not only bilingual, they're multilingual. So how do you embrace that as part of this conversation to say, I maintain and I honor my ethnicity. It doesn't make me un-American or unpatriotic.
Exactly. So you've given me some great strategies, or all of us some strategies, but I'm wondering how you have them do the activities, and then how do you get them into those conversations, and how do you set up the stage to have those honest conversations and dialogue that are often so uncomfortable, but so critically important in changing the current climate and culture and bringing people closer together? How do you transition from the activity to the conversation, and what are the points that you want to get across?
I think, to me, that it's all about the relationships that we build. Audley mentioned earlier that in many of the districts that we work in, we come into a class at least 3 times during the course of the year. So the kids get to know us. And now we do it virtually, but they still get to know us. We also get to know the teachers. I was on the phone with a teacher the other day because of an incident that happened in her classroom, and she reached out to me of what should I do in this particular instance. What we have found is how it becomes this sort of ongoing conversation is, and let me just stop for a second, because we're in February, which is Black History Month. So for many places, they think this is when we should talk about Black artists and writers and so on. This month, the shortest month of the year, by the way, which is sort of, troubling. But we talk about it throughout all the time, all year. It's not something you just talk about in February. You talk about it all the time. You have it infused in your class. Where we have had this relationship with teachers, they now send us videos and ideas. You incorporate this, or I show this in my class based on what you all talked about. So that the conversation is not the 3 times that Audley and I are there, but it's ongoing throughout the school year.
And one of the questions we asked was when we're invited by a school system or any institution or entity to sit with them, the question is, this is not a sprint. We're not into sprinting. I'm too old to sprint anyway. This is a marathon. And are you willing, therefore, because as a marathoner, there are different skill level that you have to develop as a marathoner as opposed to a sprinter. Not just that, are you prepared to shake this tree? Because, and I like the metaphor, because when you start shaking, you don't know what's going to fall off. Thirdly, if you want to do this work, remember, this work is work that is provocative, challenging, and it must become part of your DNA. this is not the flavor of the month, as Paul likes to say. So, for example, if you're talking to a school system, where's their librarian, for crying out loud? You know, your librarian needs to be a part of this conversation, because her books in the library need to reflect the conversation. The custodians need to be a part of this. Your walls in your school needs to reflect, as Paul loves to say, all sorts of heroes, not just Caucasian heroes or whoever. But if your school student population is 30% Hispanic or 30% African American or Asian, or, you know, think about it. Where are the heroes from Pakistan or Saudi Asia? Are they on your wall? That's the kind of a broad-based multicultural relationship building I think that Paul is talking about.
And curriculum and everything that you do is so important. Bob, I'm going to turn to you right now because you've had the opportunity to work with Paul and with Audley over the years. Can you describe the work that they've done with you in your classrooms and at your school?
Yes, thanks. I was fortunate enough to have moved from, and not that I didn't like moving, but I taught in Torrington, made my commute a bit easier, and wound up in Bristol. And early enough in my career where I was able to watch the impact and be impacted by the presentation that Paul and Audley brought to my then fifth graders. They were so authentic. And just like the examples that they presented and that they're sharing this morning, that relationship that they develop with not just the students, but with the teachers is so impactful. And there's that level of emotional connection behind what they do. So the next time they appear, and like the flavor of the month workshops that we often fall into in education, this is not a one-off. So when they're here for their fall and then suddenly the winter session, seeing them again reactivates all of those lessons for the students and for the adults. And I literally have people who rearrange schedules and clamor to be into the presentations. And I'm sure they're going to find ways to crash the virtual presentations coming up next week for us. But what they do is just absolutely authentic. They really help teachers and students engage in those courageous conversations about topics that really, they can easily make people uncomfortable. And what do we do when something makes us uncomfortable? We avoid it. We procrastinate. We put it off until there's that tipping point, a moment, something that that creates stress. And stressful learning conditions are not the ideal learning conditions. So if we can find an entry point, and I think that's an essential for any district, is finding that entry point to have these conversations and knowing that the work is so rooted in our efforts to promote social emotional intelligence and awareness. And if your district is fortunate enough to be doing emotional intelligence work, this is a logical next step because it's so impactful on our kids.
I love the entry point suggestion and trying to find the hook and the way to get these conversations going. Let's talk about structures and processes that you put into place in your schools, Bob. What do you as a principal do to set the stage for their work? How do you support their work while they're in your school? And what follow-up work did you as a principal do after they left or after they leave in the next week?
It's very important. I'll go echo it again, is know your audience and know your entry point. If you just approach the school community with, hey, now we're going to have this session on diversity, there can be that unintentional recoil because some might think, well, wait, do we have a problem? This one shouldn't be brought into a school because there's a problem. This should be brought into your schools because there's an opportunity. So a lot of communication in terms of that preparation, and not just with your staff, because teachers guard their kids like Papa and Mama Bears. They've got to see the value in that learning for their students, but the families and getting everybody on board. That's probably the toughest part. Once these guys are in the door for their first visit, they're never getting out. We develop those connections. The emotional connection between the kids and the teachers is palpable. And the kids go home and there's that dinner table conversation. And it's wonderful that the echo of the day's workshops is that the kids are the ones that begin to talk about their school day. Rather than the parents, where we often find ourselves in that jaws of life conversation. How was school? What'd you do? Nothing. On the days we've been fortunate enough to have Paul and Audley there, the kids go home because they have done something. And it's something very emotional and they can't wait to tell their parents, and then we're off. You've got to find ways to root it in your learning community. So the teachers are valuable, the parents are valuable, your PTO is valuable. Any opportunities that we've had to share information with our newsletters, our SMORE newsletters, or those community conversations, are the essentials. But then find ways to make it not that one off. We are fortunate enough in our school to have leadership teams, a bum crew, the building update meeting crew. These are your grassroots in the trenches folks that really have their finger on the pulse of the school. And they can relate to you where there might be issues, where there might be positives, and help reflect some of the outcomes of these lessons. But then rooting this work in your school's leadership team makes it part of the school goals. We're not just an academic, we are a developmental institution. So if we can find ways to make this part of our learning and our long range goals for kids and students, then we've definitely done something well.
Great, and that's a great segue into my next question, which I'm going to call on Cherese for. Cherese, you work with a lot of students in Connecticut. Specifically, I'd like you to talk about the work you do with the CAS Student Leadership Advisory Council and the CAS Student Equity Advisory Councils.
Thank you. So yes, I am very fortunate to work with student activities at the Connecticut Association of Schools. I have the pleasure of working with student leaders across the state, K through 12. So that's very exciting for me. The two student boards that I work closely with on a monthly basis is our State Student Council on Education and our Student Equity Advisory Board. Our State Student Advisory Council on Education is a board that meets monthly, and they are given topics each year by our Commissioner of Education, Dr. Miguel Cardona, or whoever the commissioner is at the time. And they spend the year researching those topics, and they provide recommendations at the end of the year for educators, policymakers, and the State Board of Education and the public as to how to make education better in the state of Connecticut. It's an excellent group because you really get to get the student voice, and they have the platform to provide recommendations, their perspectives. They do conduct such great research that it's just such a great presentation at the end and very helpful to our policymakers and our State Board of Education. Our Student Equity Advisory Board, I'm very proud of. We just started that this year, and that was actually started by students coming to me, students from some of our other leadership boards coming and saying, we would love to have a platform and a board where we could, talk about our diversities. We can talk about equity in education and just a safe place to do that. So with those students, along with some CAS-CIAC staff members, athletic directors, we got together in September, planned it, and started in October. And since then, we've had phenomenal guest speakers come on to speak with our students, and it's a very safe platform for them. Some of our meetings end in tears because it's so deep. It's just I'm very excited to be on that board, and we cover all sorts of issues regarding equity in education. We cover racial discrimination, religious discrimination, implicit bias towards LGBTQ, gender bias, how to cultivate interest in teaching and coaching, and administrators in Connecticut for minorities. They cover all sorts of topics. So it's a really great group, and we're excited to have that as a part of our association.
Yeah, and we definitely are. And you've been doing some great work. I'm curious as to maybe what the actual, how students have used their voices, I guess, to further their questions and their issues, and what strategies that you've used specifically that have gotten them into those honest, open conversations to be able to have these uncomfortable conversations.
Right. Well, I think Paul earlier when he responded, I think it really, the students have to be comfortable with who their speakers are and who they're working with. So many of our speakers, I think that they're very relatable. And when the students feel comfortable opening up to those speakers, and they just feel like they're in a comfortable place. So as far as having them be able to open up. And I think that's the key. It's just having a genuine presenter, having a genuine person who is leading in order for them to open up. So that's kind of the platform that we try to have so that students can be open and discuss their concerns.
And I think one of the things that Paul and Audley were talking about is it's not a one-shot deal. It's, it comes over time. So Paul and Audley, when you're working with your students or Bob in your school, what kinds of things do you do to create that safe and positive environment? And how do you help build the trust among all the stakeholders? Because I know sometimes it's really difficult when you're dealing with parent groups versus the teachers and the staff versus the students, and there may be different agendas going on at the same time. So how do you build that positive environment in order to have those open, respectful conversations?
Well, from the principal's office, I hate to reuse the word again, but that entry point is just invaluable. Knowing our school community and our audience and finding a way to root the work into what we already know is valuable for our kids. It doesn't put you in the position to try to come off like a salesperson. Even though we know the tremendous value behind the work, sometimes with those one-off sessions, the harder we sell, the more resistance or your motives might be held suspect by your faculty, by your parents. Our work in emotional intelligence makes this a logical, almost a vital part of that effort. So it was very simple in terms of a sell, in terms of helping people realize the benefits. But it's essential that that classroom be the safe environment, and all of our teachers, regardless of the level, that's job one. Is making sure your kids come into a risk supportive environment where they can ask those tough questions, where they can trust their teacher and their peers. Our classrooms through our EI work all have a classroom charter. And one of the vital ingredients in that charter is all opinions and all students will be valued and respected. So the stage is already set for those conversations. And then when you bring an expert in who can tap into that core value of a classroom, like our guys do, they're off to the races with very little in terms of that breaking the ice, because the kids are already predisposed to it, as are their teachers.
I think that the honesty of being upfront, talking that this is an emotional subject. We know that. I mean, we have done the workshop with judges and prosecutors and state police, and we've done this workshop where people have turned their back to us, and some have walked out of the meeting, some have decided not to come back after the first break. So an acknowledgement that the conversation around diversity is a very difficult one. It is. It's provocative. It's unnerving. But putting that honesty out there, that's one. Secondly, moving the conversation around shaming and blaming from the conversation. Thirdly, I think, Paul, we have tried to do this in a dialogue, not a monologue. So we do not come into a school system to preach and to lecture. That when we come in one of the first conversation, Paul, that this is a conversation, and like any other conversation that human beings have, it is going to be painful sometimes. But one of the first issues is an issue of respect, and I think most audience will see the respect that exists between Paul and I. Now think about it. Paul was born in Springfield, Massachusetts, the bedrock of American civilization. I mean, come on here.
A world-known resort.
There, I was born in Negril, Jamaica, the resort of the world. I mean, for all intents and purposes, Paul and I should not be sitting together in the same room, having or leading the discussion. But because people see the interaction and how we cross-fertilize the respect at the core of how we do this, and that's the first entity. I mean, the first ingredient in a conversation around diversity has to be respect. It has to begin from the notion that I respect you as a human being. You can add academic, whatever benchmarks and whatever else you want to put onto it, but the notion is Paul Vivian respects me and I respect Paul Vivian, and it begins there. And in every system that we've gone into, Paul, you can correct me if I'm wrong, one of the first place we say, let's start there. Even before you do the unpacking and the shaking, we begin from the notion with parents. This is a cross-fertilization that is based on the notion of respect. Take away everything else, and it begins there.
I think the other thing that we tie in, which we haven't discussed right now, is in the whole notion of with this concept of being an upstander. So we talk about with kids, and this is again over a series as we've gotten to know them. The person who's bullying someone, the bully, and then there's the victim, and then there are bystanders. And we get the kids to agree that most of us are bystanders. But when we don't do anything or say something, then we enable or encourage that bullying behavior to continue. And so what Audley and I do, and we role play this with each other, we show videos. So in fact, Starbucks, the coffee place, has these wonderful videos on true life upstanders in the community who have stood up to something because they didn't think it was right. And they're really done very well. We oftentimes will use them as a catalyst in our conversation. But we also give examples of, so if somebody's making fun of someone and you stand there and watch, then you are really giving audience to that participate and you're encouraging them. So what else can you do? And you don't have to get up on a chair and give a speech, but you can walk away. And by walking away, you are taking ownership by using your feet to say, I don't want to stand here and listen to this. So we give kids examples of the variety of ways in which they can be upstanders. Because as we all know, bullying takes place in all forms at all ages and doesn't end when you graduate from high school. And I think we need to really talk about those tools. So we incorporate that because it ties into differences. So often people are made fun of or bullied because of their differences. And then what can we do about that as a way of saying, I don't want to support that.
Great. And so true. So one of my questions is how might we try to, no matter how much we try to be neutral and fair, we all bring our own values, beliefs, experiences, and our biases to each and every situation that we encounter. How do you help people recognize and understand their own values, biases, perspectives, and beliefs, which really gets at that upstander kind of thing that you're talking about? How do you help people recognize those feelings when they may not even know that they exist?
I guess,
Go ahead, Audley. Yeah.
no, I guess the first thing is to acknowledge that we all have them. You can deny it all you want. We all have them. When Paul and I stand in front of the kids and say, which one of us has an accent? And the kids go, Audley have an accent. And I go, I do? I didn't know that. So Paul doesn't have an accent? No. We trivialize this, but the truth is, along with having an accent goes a whole bunch of other things, Paul, that they think about. So it means I'm a foreigner. I'm an immigrant. I'm probably an illegal alien or whatever. So we all have them, and the triggers that trigger them can be so simple as an accent. So I think the first thing when you enter into an institution with any audience is to, let's be honest, we all have these biases. We actually do an activity called perceptions, Paul. If you want to explain perception, which is a very powerful, because it goes to the core of identifying that every individual walks around with our own biases, like an American Express. We never leave home without them.
Yeah, so we do this after we've gotten to know the kids a while longer, and we do this with adults, which is you try to identify the first thing that flashes across your mind when we say a statement. Don't think about it. So a person who lives in a trailer park is, a person who speaks with a Southern accent is, and the first thing that flashes across your mind, that's your stereotype. No, and we always, there's nothing wrong with that. You just need to know you have that. If you begin to act on that, that's a different story. So we do this activity with adults so that they begin to recognize. There are a lot of giggles and kind of oops when people do this, because they realize the stereotypes that we all carry around. And we talk about the fact of, but when you then morph that stereotype into treating someone differently, then it becomes discrimination. And how do you stop yourself or make yourself aware of that I am now making that jump from my stereotype, which I just giggled at because I realized, oops, it's kind of a stereotype, but then I treat people differently based on that. Mm-hmm. So we try to do that with kids and get them to recognize. One of the things that we say, we talk about words. So if I use the word, and Audley does this really well, where he talks about, if I use the word retard as a put down of my friend, my good buddy, who I know does not have any mental health capacity issues, that how can that still be harmful by using that term? That I may hear that And I might have someone in my family who has Down syndrome. And that really hits me and that really hurts. Or if I'm using the word gay as a put down, again, I'm joking around with my buddies. Oh, you're so gay, I say. Well, what about the kid who has two moms or two dads who's sitting in that room, or who's someone who's wrestling with their own sexuality?
Absolutely, yes.
They then see that as, I'm not telling anyone about this because I'm going to be put down. So we try to make kids aware of the fact that even in our joking, that we can be hurtful. And I'll just give the quick story about my granddaughter. So we were in a school actually in Bristol, and we showed a picture of Barack Obama, and we said, "What race is Barack Obama?" And a girl in the back of the room said, "He's a mutt,"
Right.
M-U-T-T, like a dog. And so I said to the girl when she said this, I said, that's really hurtful to me. Now I should share that my granddaughter is biracial, and she had just been born when this girl said this. So I know this was very much on my mind. But the first thing that flashed across my mind was, I don't want my granddaughter being called a mutt.
That's right.
I want people thinking of her as a mutt. So I shared that with the student, not in a put down, just said, that was hurtful. And I told her the reason why. And I said, I know you were saying that as a joke. And and the kids did laugh. A lot of kids laughed. But you have to look at how that hurt, because having someone in your family who's biracial is not something you can tell just by looking at someone.
Right.
And so by making a joke about that, you don't know who you might be hurting.
Right.
And it really did have an impact on that girl. And I wasn't trying to embarrass her, although I did want to point it out to her. She came up to me afterwards and really was apologetic.
Right.
More importantly, I said, I'm glad, because I think you'll think before you say those kinds of things, because you never know who you might be hurting or upsetting. And so to me, that's the real key, is to get the kids to think about their words and what they do. Her intent was not to hurt my feelings. But the ironic thing, the girl sitting next to her in the class was biracial. Right next to her. She didn't realize that. And when we asked, are there any other kids in this class who were biracial? In a class of like 22 kids, 10 of them were biracial. So you might think you're joking around, but it could still be very hurtful to someone. That's the point we've got to get across.
I think it's
That's a-
very important. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think it's really important for those conversations to happen, because if they don't happen, and if kids don't recognize that, this is hurtful or this is wrong, then they're going to grow up to continue to do that. So I think that was a great teaching moment for her. And sometimes it's just having that conversation, because like you said, she probably had no idea that she was hurting anyone's feelings,
Right.
or, had no harm in it. But when you don't know, sometimes you just don't know unless someone tells you. So sometimes I think that's the most important, to have those difficult conversations, and so people can recognize that, this is, not something that you should say or something you should think about before you speak.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think part of that too, Cherese, is getting America to sanitize our language.
Mhm.
Because think about it. I mean, there are a barrage of unsanitized, unfiltered languages and verbiage coming to our children from all over. I mean, forget social media. I mean, good Lord. In their music that they listen to, you know what I mean? So where do they sanitize it, and who sanitizes it for them? And that's the challenge. I mean, and if the adults are not doing it, then, and if we ourselves are not sanitizing our language, or maybe even worse, if we're weaponizing our verbiage, how much harm are we doing to our children? I mean, remember this for a second. Years ago, when Don Imus referred to the Rutgers basketball team as a bunch of nappy-headed hoes, excuse the language, I apologize for that, and America took him to task, he then turned around and said, don't blame me, blame Lil Wayne and Snoop Dogg and all of the other guys who are using this unsanitized, unfiltered language to your children. I'm just repeating it. But the bottom line is the buck has to stop somewhere.
And I think these are all great examples of how do you get someone else to understand what it feels like to walk in their shoes, and to try to help build empathy, which is so important when we're dealing with conversations like this. One of my favorite authors, Adam M. Grant, who's written Originals, How Nonconformists Move the World, and his most recent book, Think Again, has written, and I quote, "Argue like you're right and listen like you're wrong," unquote. And he's also tweeted, "Let's agree to disagree shouldn't end in a discussion. It should shift to a new goal, understanding each other, not persuading each other." From your work and your experiences, do you agree or disagree with that thinking, and why?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating, and Audley identified this earlier, is the mere fact, we use the analogy of an iceberg. That's one of the first lessons we do with fifth graders. And we show how foolish it was for the Titanic captain to judge an iceberg by the tip, because that's what he could see. And at that time, they didn't realize what was beneath the surface. And we do that with people all the time. We judge them by what we can see. We make assumptions. We have stereotypes. We treat them differently based on that tip, where 85 to 90% of them, we don't know. And one of the things we talk about with the kids, and we use this as an example of the multi-layeredness of our conversation, is that on the surface, Audley and I look different, but beneath the surface, our interests, so many of the things are very, very similar because we've taken the time to get to know one another. And so to me, it's about building a relationship where someone can see. So if we always use this as an example. When we met each other 30 years ago, if we said, oh, we're of a different race, he's from a different country than me, we could never be friends, then we wouldn't be. But the fact that we took that chance, we found that we have way more in common than we have different. And that's what we want for our kids. I want my kids to recognize the fact that their best friend might be someone who looks totally different than they do, or sounds totally different than they do. And I don't want them to cut that opportunity off because they look different or sound different.
I know you're going to ask a question, Rosie, that's in the question and answer. But let me just go back there for a quick second, Paul. One of the things we're leading now in Southington, we're leading a listening activity on ethnicity. We've asked all the kids to go home and talk to Nana and Grandpa and whatever about their ethnicity and their practices and what happened when they came to America and all that. And all of that is part of recognizing that America is a land of immigrants. I mean, unless you're a Native American, Native Indian, somebody from somewhere, come from somewhere, but honoring the ethnicity that exists in America and making it not as a disqualifier, but a point of celebration, as Bob would probably agree with me. And the only way to do that, though, Rosa, is to listen. There is so much learning going on in Southington right now. Kids are learning about kids from Pakistan, and they're hearing about the food they cook in Pakistan, in Albania, in the Ukraine. In fact, first of all, Southington is recognizing, oh my God, Southington is more diverse than I thought, for crying out loud. Think about it for a second. Some Albanian kids shouted, the Albanians are here. And all of a sudden, oh, are you really? Yeah, we're not passing through anymore. This is home for us. So now there may be an Albanian restaurant popping up on the corner of Queen Street in the next couple of weeks, and a Ukrainian restaurant. And all of that is an opportunity for Southington to spend time. Paul, the activity we do with kids, which is simply 60 seconds to sit there and listen uninterrupted without anything else except listening to the person talk about themselves and their ethnicity. How powerful is that, Paul, when that's not something that America does very well because we're just too busy doing everything else?
You know, and we should talk about the fact of where that came from. I mean, you know, obviously over the past few years, when we raised the question of what is an immigrant in every school district we're in, and we're in like 7, the first thing we would hear is someone who comes here illegally. Mm-hmm. And we're there, and Audley would say, wait a minute, I'm an immigrant. And I tell the story of my grandmother, who is my hero, because she was an immigrant and she came here as a young girl to this country. And all of us have those stories. So part of our motivation for sharing these immigration stories is that each of us in our family, again, unless you're a Native American, someone in your family came from someplace else and they took a lot of risks. And they really, really were probably terrified coming here, maybe not knowing the language, so that you could have a better life, so that each of us could have a better life. And that's what we want kids to think about when they hear the word immigrant. Think of that hero in your life. And then we take it a step further and we talk about the economics of immigration, because we do this with 7th graders, talking about that immigrants create jobs in this country. They don't take jobs. I mean, Google was founded by an immigrant, eBay, Chobani Yogurt, Tesla, and I can name a ton. There are so many positions that were created by immigrants. So we want them to have those facts. So when someone says, oh, immigrants, they're just come here, they're takers, they come here with their hands out, they come here to go on welfare. It's absolutely not true. Absolutely not true. But we need to give kids the facts so they know that.
So part of any conversation is a lot of times we just want to talk, but it's also that listening is so important. I have a question that came in. One of our listeners wants to know, how can you share how your work is expanded to include discussions about transgender students?
So depending on the age of the kids that we're in, we do talk about that. So we talk with high school kids. We work in Region 12 with high school kids, and we actually met with a group of LGBTQ council that they had there. And we talk about the acceptance and the difficulties of being a trans kid in the school, or someone who's wrestling with, their identity and who they are. The bottom line that we talk about in everything is no one should be ashamed of who they are. No one, regardless of your sexuality, your race, your ethnicity, the language you speak, that we all need to be treated as humans. And so we take it down to that basis, because there's a demonization that takes place with people, and part of it's through social media, and there's political reasons as well. But the bottom line is it's ongoing, and that we need to address the fact that it's happening, and we need to identify people's humanness in who they are. So we talk about it from that level of acceptance, of that we accept everyone of who they are, no matter how they identify.
On a state level, with our Student Equity Advisory Board, we have grades 9 through 12 on the board. And part of what we do is the same thing, is creating that space of acceptance. We also have a group that is specifically doing research on implicit bias towards the LGBTQ. And that research that they'll conduct throughout the rest of the school year will be presented to educators, policymakers, State Board of Education at the end of the year, and the public, with recommendations as to how can educators help to create a safe space for that specific group in schools. What are some positive things that schools can do, positive activities, clubs, whatever needs to be done for everyone to feel accepted and included is their goal in that group. So hopefully we'll have some good research about that at the end of the year, and everyone can come to see that, those recommendations.
Cherese, while you're talking, can you also share with us some of the ways that your students have shared their voices and used their voices on some of the issues that concern them?
Yeah, absolutely. So same thing, we have multiple groups that are working on different issues. So I named most of them for our Student Equity Advisory Board. Also our State Student Advisory Council on Education, just to stray off a little bit, is working on, even though it's really currently what's going on in our world, is how to support and maintain student interest during a pandemic, and strategies to rebuild school communities in person and online. So again, they've been researching throughout the year, and the goal is at the end of the year to be able to present that information to educators and State Board of Education policymakers, also to just get their voice out to anyone, anyone who will listen, because a lot of these topics that they work on, they're not, people don't talk about them much. We don't have those conversations, again, those uncomfortable conversations. So for them to be able to open up these uncomfortable conversations, talk about them to our guest speakers who come on, we have policymakers who come on, national board members from our National Federation of State High Schools who come on to our meetings. Our Commissioner of Education, Dr. Miguel Cardona, came on, and those are the times where our students have they have the chance to speak what's on their mind and talk about some of the issues going on, and hope that as a community we can make things better for our students in Connecticut. So yeah, so great work. Our students are doing phenomenal work. One more thing I want to mention about their voices is we have a great video coming out soon, hopefully by the end of this month, with our Student Equity Advisory Board, about 11 members from the board, just talking about their journey in schools and their background and some of the issues that's going on in their schools. So we are going to get a lot of information out of those videos and just very touching stories that are just tremendous. So you can look out for that as well.
I can't wait to hear that. I was just sitting here thinking as you were talking that we need to do a webinar with your students, because I think
yeah.
educators could really learn from the student voices. So I'm glad you're doing that video, and we'll stay in touch, I'm sure. Since they
would love to come on a webinar.
Perfect. So, and I could stay here and talk all day, but it looks like we're pretty much out of time. But I'm going to ask each one of you one final question to kind of summarize what we're doing. And so, as you know, throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, the United States of America became known worldwide as the Great Melting Pot. However, ex-President Jimmy Carter once said, and I quote, "We become not a melting pot, but a beautiful mosaic. Different people, different beliefs, different yearnings, different hopes, different dreams," end quote. So my question is, how do we lift up and champion all of these different perspectives to change the metaphor from a melting pot to a beautiful mosaic where we can celebrate not only our diversity, but more importantly, our uniquenesses, so we can respectfully, peacefully, and successfully live and work together? Take it away.
A deep question.
Yeah, multi-million-dollar. We've been going at this for a while, haven't we, Paul? And we've called this so many different names: multiculturalism, cultural competency, cultural sensitivity, you name it, by whatever name it is. I think America needs to amplify that this is real, and to admit that this conversation needs to happen in every walk of life. We need to make an admission that there is an issue with this, with our country, and we need to talk. We need to spend time. We need to honor the conversation. We need to give time to it. Not only that, we need to put our money where our mouth is. I think too often we're invited because there's an incident. And I think too many communities wait until there's an incident. And so this conversation becomes incident-based. And Paul and I know that when a diversity conversation is incident-based, it becomes very defensive, and people begin to take sides, and people begin to scream at each other. We have been plotting at this, Mr. Vivian, in a marathon way, so that it's not just an incident-based. And I think that's where America needs to begin. This is a real conversation. It needs to happen across the board. We don't need to wait until there's a George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or any such thing. It needs to happen every day, in every home, around every dining table, in every institution, in every pulpit, all across.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree. And I feel like the work that you all are doing and that, schools are doing across the state is helping to change that. I think starting from elementary school is key. It's important to start there, and everyone should be educated. Elementary students through 12th grade and beyond, parents, teachers, administration, everyone. So that way those uncomfortable conversations will hopefully someday become comfortable, and we're able to open up and respect each other and accept each other. So I feel like that's where it starts. You start young and continue throughout, and hopefully that'll make a better America.
Cherese, I love that you said elementary school, because if you're going to affect the crop from a farming metaphor, you don't do it at the harvest, you do it when you're planting. And to start that conversation young, we've got to be tenacious about this work. We have conversations about school culture and school improvement and positive climate. This is an integral element in your school culture. So being tenacious and staying at this will have long-lasting benefits for your kids, for your staff, for your entire school community.
And I look at and I love the metaphor that you quoted, Rosie, but I think I look at more as a jigsaw puzzle. In this pandemic time, lots of people are doing jigsaw puzzles, and the pieces are all different. And it's hard to do that. It's hard to make them sort of fit. But in order for the jigsaw puzzle to show its beauty, we all need to fit together and work together. And I think one of the things that our country, this unfinished country that our poet laureate said at the inauguration that had is, how do we all fit together, this diverse group of people from all over the world, who have come here to call America home and to make it work and make it fit. And it's hard. It's not easy, like a jigsaw puzzle. You got to continue to look at how can I make these pieces fit to work. But that sense of accomplishment, even when you put two pieces together, is so powerful. And so what we do is just one step in this process. When Audley and I come into a classroom, the kids are excited. Oh, Paul and Audley are here. But part of that, I know it's because we're different. We joke around and we're different than their regular teacher. But the other part of it is, I think we also we look at that as a huge opportunity to leave them with something that gets them thinking. Some of the most powerful lessons I think we do is when we get kids like that girl who used the word mutt, not thinking that it would hurt someone, or kids who use the word gay or retard as put downs, or kids who make fun of kids for being slow readers, not realizing they might have a disability or that English might have to be their first language, or that Audley always celebrates the fact that to be bilingual or multilingual is such a positive thing. And I can look at the kids in our classes who begin to beam because they hide the fact that they speak Spanish at home. They're embarrassed about it, or they're told, it's so fascinating that they're told they shouldn't, really celebrate that. Yet when they go out looking for a job, when they graduate from wherever, high school, college, wherever, the first thing that goes on their resume is I'm bilingual. I mean, that's a huge plus. So we need to celebrate that. So it's a long-winded answer of saying, I think it's more of a jigsaw puzzle. And our piece, we try to get pieces to fit together, and that sense of accomplishment when that does happen.
Rosie, can I just say one last thing on my part? Do not believe either. When Megan, who is the superintendent in Region 12, invited us to come there, and I think, Region 12? There's nothing going on up in there. I mean, that you guys are nestled behind and away from all of it. And she says, no, do not think that because you're geographically or demographically removed from all of the madness that's going on, that you're so protected that you should not be a part of this conversation. And that's what I think Cherese and I are saying, that everyone, whether you're Timbuktu or Walla Walla, Texas, or wherever you are, needs to be a part of it. Because your kids may end up in college in Walla Walla or in, you wherever they and then encounter a biracial, bicultural, bi whatever kid, and they go, oh, you know what I mean? So everyone needs to be a part of this conversation.
Absolutely right. And these conversations are so important, and they need to be proactive. They need to be ongoing, and they need to be in safe places. So I want to just say thank you so much for all of you for sharing your wisdom and experiences on this critically important topic of helping us understand the what and the why and the how of creating those safe and comfortable spaces and places where we can encourage and facilitate those often uncomfortable but necessary conversations. I'm hopeful that from the work that you all are doing, and many of our administrators and educators who are viewing our webinar are doing, we can transform the world's perspective from that melting pot to a beautiful mosaic or a jigsaw puzzle. I think that's so important. What a wonderful world it would be if we could open our conversations with, let's begin by agreeing to disagree and then listen like we're wrong, so we can actually learn how to walk in each other's shoes and truly champion the uniqueness and celebrate our similarities and differences and build that colorful, beautiful mosaic or jigsaw puzzle. Again, Paul, Audley, Bob, and Cherese, on behalf of all of us at CAS, I can't thank you enough for joining us today and sharing your knowledge, your experiences, and your expertise. For our viewers, if you're interested in learning more about this topic, please feel free to contact consultants Paul Vivian and Audley Donaldson. Their emails are listed on the slide. Bob Garry is the principal of Hatton School in Southington, and Cherese Miller-Odukwe at CAS are also available to answer your questions. Their emails are also listed here on the slide. Once again, I want to thank our corporate partners, Justin, Horseman, Liberty Bank, the Connecticut Army National Guard, and Pullman and Comley for helping to make this webinar possible. We thank them for their continuing support of our CAS professional development webinars for all principals and educators in Connecticut. We hope that you'll join us for our next webinar, When, What, Who, and Why, the Perils, Pitfalls, and Parameters of Mandated Reporting at 10 a.m. on February 25th, 2021. Over the past few years, there have been arrests of and criminal proceedings against school administrators and staff for failing to fulfill their reporting obligations. Join us as Pullman and Comley answer questions and provide practical conundrums faced by school personnel in determining responsibilities as mandated reporters. Again, a special thank you to our very knowledgeable panel of experts. I would also like to thank all of you for joining us today. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted for future viewing on the CAS website. Please share the link with your colleagues once it's posted. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Stay safe, stay well, stay warm, and may spring and summer be right around the corner.